Welcome to In Conversation. My guest today is Kent Worcester, known for a variety of talents. Kent is an American political scientist, a historian, a songwriter. His work deals with popular culture, intellectual history, trade unions, and social democracy. Kent is also known, of course, for his work on superheroes and comic books. Kent, I want to welcome you to the show. I'd also like to say it seems fitting that you're calling in from New York City today, aka the Rotten Apple, which many of our viewers will know is the natural habitat for Marvel's legendary character, the Punisher, aka Frank Castle, who of course happens to be the main focus of a brand new book published by Intellect, written by yourself, A Cultural History of the Punisher, Marvel Comics and the Politics of Vengeance, which of course I must say is also now available as it was recently published, so hot off the press. But I want to jump right in and ask you, why the Punisher? Why did you choose this particular character for such a close textual analysis?
I first started reading comic books in graduate school as a break from political science and political philosophy. And I spent a lot of time in a comic book store on the Upper West Side. And one day I saw a comic book about New York City and about a character named Frank Castle. And I bought that issue, and within a couple of issues, this was sometime in the late 80s, it was clear to me that this would make a great book. Most Marvel characters, of course, even though New York exists in the Marvel universe, and even though the Marvel universe tries to be as realistic as possible in some ways, right? People complain about the weather, and the streets are not always beautiful. So Marvel's always had a grittier aspect than DC on the whole, and that appealed to me. But the New York story appealed to me, and most even Marvel characters are somewhat detached from reality. But Frank Castle is a character who's trying to kind of interfere with reality in a way, trying to make the world more in his image. And so he's a fascinating kind of indicator of where comics went and where they might be going.
And it sounds like then that you encountered the character and the comic book for the first time when you were a grad student, is that right? So it wasn't like a childhood favorite for you?
No, the character's introduced in 74, and so it's about 50 years. And I had enjoyed things like Peanuts and comic strips, but didn't grow up in the kind of household where comic books were encouraged. Mad Magazine was banned. Really the difference, the sort of just stark, just leaving graduate school and entering the world of comics was a lot of fun. I think the Punisher is a special character. A lot of what gets written about comic book characters focuses on their aesthetics. And some of the Punisher imagery is very striking. It has lots of guns and lots of skulls and lots of violence. But from my reading, what makes the character interesting is his politics, is his sort of relationship to the world around him, the kind of criminals he targets, the kind of rationale he gives, the degree to which he gives readers a opportunity to kind of exult in bloodshed. Right. Those seem to me to be interesting questions. And what I've always been looking for is where kind of politics and culture converge, popular culture. And so you can find some political material in a Superman comic. In the early 60s, I think, Superman Clark Kent goes on strike. But my argument is that comic books are only occasionally political, but the Punisher is always political. And I like to think it took somebody with a background in political studies to make sense of a character who offers, and these are not my words, an alternative location for the discussion of justice.
That's fascinating. I'm really enjoying your insights. And it kind of leads me to one of the questions I did want to ask you today, is that you're arguably best known for your work, your biographies on political history, your work on C.L.R. James, for example. So how did we go from your work on C.L.R. James to writing about Frank Castle?
Yeah, I think of them actually as they're certainly the two most ambitious projects I've ever worked on. Most of what I've done is edited books, and I'm working with collaborators. Both the CLR biography and the Frank Castle book took about 5 years each. And it may not make sense, but I think of the Punisher book as a kind of biography, a biography of a fictional character. But if you think about it in a certain way, C.L.R. James represents the most optimistic take on the 20th century. And he represents that kind of tremendous radical energy of the early years of the 20th century. He's born in 1901. He becomes political during World War I as a young Trinidadian. And E.P. Thompson at one point says, we would not know what optimism really means were it not for Comrade James. And I think in a way the same holds for the Punisher, except we would not know what pessimism means were it not for Frank Castle. Because what you have over these 50 years is the story of somebody who will always be angry and who will always see violence as the solution to that emotional problem. And both James's way of seeing the world is very powerful, and Frank Castle's way of seeing the world is very powerful. And I suppose in my own life, I've gone from a little bit of a position of optimism to a position of pessimism. So even though Frank Castle's solutions are not my solution, his despair is, I think, has some legitimate basis.
Well, let me ask you this then, because you've alluded to how we've got meaning from these characters or from these biographies. I love that analogy as well. And I believe that the book really is a biography of Frank Castle. That's how I read it, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so engaging as well, because it does page turns in that way. But this, part of the title and something that you refer to is this notion of the politics of vengeance. So what does that mean in this context? And tell us a little bit about why that's important to this study, and also to perhaps the character, and why the character has such an alluring appeal now, and perhaps now more than ever.
Well, one of the things I did with the book was I started not really with Frank Castle, although I do in the sense that the introduction is about him, but the first chapter is about New York City. Most of the people who've written about the Punisher, and he hasn't attracted a lot of scholarship, but most of the people who've written about the Punisher focus on his status as a Vietnam vet. And yet very few of the comics are about Vietnam. I don't want to say that the Vietnam angle is unimportant. What I think I have now come to understand about the character, having read basically every story the character's in, I might have missed one or two, but having read enough of the character, it becomes clear to me that there's a kind of late 60s, early 70s moment where you have an entire generation, perhaps, or certainly some segment of the population experiencing Vietnam, crime, urban riots, and other forms of dislocation as a kind of civilizational catastrophe. And in the case of the Frank Castle, he decides that civilizational catastrophe gives him the right to shoot as many criminals as possible before the authorities stop him, which of course turns out to be never, since he's a popular character. And so he has what we call plot armor to defend him. But that New York setting, I think, is key and haunts not only the creators, because he is very much the product of that early 70s despair that New York City's experiencing, but I think the audience as well brings that narrative of urban crisis to their appreciation for the character. And I think even now, decades after New York got on its feet and brought the murder rate down, and real estate and the hospital sector and the university sectors have all grown tremendously, and yet there's still this underlying anxiety, which is partly concocted, but partly, I think, organic, which is there not only in the daily lives of many New Yorkers, but it still informs how we talk about New York. and how we write about New York in the world of fiction. And so what I argue in chapter 1 is that Vietnam is the flip side of the same coin, which is where New York is on at the face of the side of the coin, where the coin is saying, you know, we have these hopes and dreams for the country, for our city, for our political system in the 50s and early 60s after World War II. And all of those dreams lie in rubble by the mid 70s. And Frank Castle and many other people blame liberal elites effectively. And so it is a story about liberal elites and how out of touch they are. And that's not a story that engages readers before the early 70s in a way that it engages readers after the early 70s. It is one of the great narratives of our time.
And of course has a lot of resonance now again with the current political situation. And so yeah, maybe you could talk us a little bit about that. And you've said, you know, all costumed heroes have their political moments, but the Punisher is political. And I think that people who only have a cursory understanding or knowledge of the character or of Marvel or of comic books will definitely see that and can see that this character is definitely a little different. And even when Batman's at his most vigilante, presented in certain comics, Legends of the Dark Knight, those iterations of the Batman on the darker side, you know, Frank Castle is clearly much more politicized and speaking to a broader culture rather than about a personal story. I think his personal story is greater than just the sum of its parts. So yeah, what's going on there? You know, tell us a little bit about the politics of the Punisher and why you think that so many different groups, but also quite a few right-wing groups in recent years have really kind of taken on the character and the iconography of the Punisher and made it their own.
Well, at first there's some ambiguity about his sort of purpose, his motivation. On the cover of his first appearance, they refer to him as a hitman, which implies that he works for money, which I think is a poor fit with the idea of a kind of ideologically motivated killer. And they also, I think weren't sure how fully committed they were to the character. Jerry Conway, who's the key creator of the Punisher, thought he would kill him off in the first issue. You know, he's so charged, he's so angry, he's so surrounded by just dangerous objects that a kind of life that ends in self-destruction is a very easy way to tell the Punisher story. It's, I think, the historical context that explains his survival and his becoming a not just a comic star, but a kind of cultural star. My argument about violence versus punishment is pretty straightforward, and it did require that I go back and read some of the people that I had last read in graduate school, like Hobbes and Schmidt and Locke and so on. You know, if I punch somebody on the street, which I'm not going to do, and somebody says, "Why did you do that?" I can say, "I don't know," and that be understood as a reasonable answer. Or if I said, you know, because it was raining, and somebody would be like, "Well, that's that guy's motivations." But if I punch somebody and then say I'm punishing you, that carries a whole bunch of extra logical connotations that aren't there with violence. And so from my point of view, just the decision to name the character the Punisher is a crucial turning point. The original name for the character was the Assassin, which is a little like Hitman. But as Stan Lee pointed out, because Stan Lee was still in the office at this point in New York, at least sometimes, as Stan Lee pointed out, you couldn't really change a character called the Assassin.
True, yeah.
You know, you couldn't soften him. You couldn't turn him into a likable anti-hero. Whereas I think by the 80s, by the mid-80s, Frank Castle had become an anti-hero for Marvel. The interesting thing is that he never became a likable anti-hero. And I think that's why he remains a polarizing figure in comics and in the culture more generally. The likability of some anti-heroes kinds of tames the acidic nature of the anti-hero. The Punisher is almost always told, stories about the Punisher are almost always written in a way that accentuate that acidity. And I think that acidity, his kind of toxic relation to the world around him, like, why aren't you killing that person? You know, this person's giving us information, but they're also a bad guy. We need to kill them as well. This is a kind of Punisher death logic. That's a logic of punishment. You know, there's this great quote from Kropotkin, who wrote an essay, The Anarchist Theorist, 19th century Russian anarchist theorist, where he says punishment takes over, and I don't have the exact quote, but something like punishment takes over and becomes the only cause. And the Punisher is a exercise in storytelling, which asks the question of what happens when you introduce a character who's always angry, who always believes that death is the answer, and whose story is not just personal, but is about, and not just about Vietnam, but ultimately, I think, at its core, about New York City. The fact that his wife and family are gunned down in Central Park, it seems to me, is not an incidental detail, but is the detail that sets the whole thing into motion.
That's really interesting, because I had never really, before reading your book, considered how important place is not only to this character, but to the franchise and to various different adaptations, and of course to your reading as well. So that thanks for alluding to that here as well, because I think that's really important, something that perhaps has not been quite as adequately discussed previously. While we're just talking about the writing and the writers, though, that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the process and also about the writing, your own, but of the comic itself. I mean, you must have trawled through 5 decades worth of material, not only the source material, the original comic books, but also the various adaptations, the Netflix series, and various other incarnations, adaptations, translations that have materialized over the years. I believe the Punisher is one of the more reproduced characters in the Marvel universe as well. So yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about that process. Did you go deep into the archives, and how did you, what was your research methodology, if you will? And then just from that, I was wondering if you could then perhaps also tell us a little bit about the different decades and whether there were any that sort of stood out for you, that maybe perhaps had a richer vein of intrigue that you kind of pursued in your actual own research. If there's any decades, periods, or writers that stand out. But yeah, let's start by talking about the process and how you went into the archives, and how you must have hustled a few comic book dealers to try and get hold of some of those rarities and obscure classics.
He was never, he's always been a character who's appealed to some part of the audience and not to others. And so I don't think he's a character who's ever had a single issue go for $1,000 or anything like that. I had been collecting the character, thinking in the back of my mind I would do something with him. And at some point, the stars aligned, and enough was off my table that I thought, okay, I have to finally write this Punisher book. I didn't know it would take me so long that the book would come out in effect in time for the 50th anniversary, but that's a happy accident. I did think it was possible somebody else would be writing a book on the same character, maybe taking a similar approach, but that happily didn't happen, at least not yet. So I had 2 boxes of comics, and then went online and into shops to make sure I completed different series. But I had 85% of the entire run in boxes. What really needed to happen was immersing myself, not so much in the Punisher, who I'd been following, but in the kind of paraliterature of vengeance fiction. So I read all the Dirty Harry novels and the Death Wish novels, and about 200 men's adventure stories, often quite violent, Executioner and other characters. I suppose my favorite is a character known as the Owl, who doesn't need to sleep. Nice. And he prowls LA in a couple of really wonderfully overwritten books.
That's a new one to me.
He's an angry owl. So that was my research method. Another thing I did was watch as many movies as I could from the late 60s through to the mid 90s that were about New York and violence and crime. So I suppose I watched about 150 films. Some of them are listed in the appendix. You know, the character shifts in interesting ways. My attachment to the character, and I think for a lot of readers my age or 10 years younger, is through print. And what I figured out in writing the book is that with a character like this, print is very different from, say, tattoos or streaming shows.
Mm-hmm.
Print can have letters columns. Print can have allows for competing visions coming out in the same month, right? So there have been times where there have been as many as 5 Punisher comics on the shelves. This is in the early 90s, 30 years ago. And all 5 would have different points of view because, of course, you can tell a story of angry vengeance in lots of different ways. You can tell that story in a way which suggests that the real problem is the economic system.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell that story in a way where you find out that some right-winger is actually a neo-Nazi, which happens quite a lot in Punisher stories. And you can find out that the real enemy are eco freaks and Jane Fonda lookalike who shows up in the 90s comic. So print can be told, consumed, digested, interpreted in lots of ways. And what I realized is once you get to the movies at the end of the 90s and then the television, the streaming, you see a kind of funneling of storytelling to a safer, so the kind of the right wing and the left wing excesses of certain writers, and I say excessives in a kind of friendly way. I don't mean that in a scolding way. But what an editor or publisher might regard as excesses, all of that gets taken out by Disney and Netflix.
Oh, right.
Right. I mean, so the character in John Bernthal's interpretation is recognizable. They're taking a lot of characters from the comics.
Violence, of course.
It is a streamlined process where the idiosyncrasy of individual runs is absolutely smoothed over. And then when you have the kind of triumph of the iconography in the last 10 years, where you have mostly police, army, and sort of conservative groups and pro-gun groups taking up Punisher iconography, that conversation is even more channeled into a sort of single form of conversation than a screen, let alone print. So I'm fondest in a way of the print Punisher, where I can point to lots of crazy moments and what were they thinking and just delightful paradoxes and moments where writers really just say, dear reader, this character is interestingly difficult and one you might want to think about. That can't happen in screen, and it certainly doesn't happen when people tattoo a skull to their arm. That's just signifying that they're prepared to kill their enemies.
That's a really interesting point there, that I had thought about in the past, but one that is very much worth, I think, highlighting again. This notion about comic books and how there may be multiple stories on the table each week, multiple different political ideologies at play, all within the same company, the same character tropes. This is really interesting because it's something that I noticed as a kid when I first encountered Batman. I thought Batman was kind of lame, not for me. And then I encountered some of the darker, grittier, more questioning, like his mentality and his moral sensibilities, you know, and I guess that's a lot of that's what then maybe Nolan took for the Batmans of recent years. And I think that that's amazing because then at the same time you can have your more like 1960s style, wow, geez, let's go get him, Batman, alongside, and the same with Frank Castle and the Punisher. But Batman is a character that I perhaps know a bit more from my own personal reading. So I think that's really interesting, and I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head a bit there as well. With like, if someone chooses to have the Punisher symbol, the skull, tattooed on their body, then there's probably not too much nuance there. I mean, I might be doing them a disservice, but that's very interesting. I think that the comic books allow for these different readings, and I think cross culture, that's something that we don't pay enough kind of homage to.
And just quickly, sometimes you even get writers talking to each other.
Yeah, right. A little bit of
right?
a jab and a sparring contest almost, or a knowing glance. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And you
that's,
get the character parodied by other writers, and sometimes by writers working on the character would then parody the character in other comics. So I think a lot of people in comics were kind of both mystified and unsettled by the sense of connection that the Punisher has with some part of the audience.
yeah.
And some of the comics really play with that, where minor characters will talk about how intimidating the character is and how you're here, you obviously want to shoot me. And he's like, no, I just want gas. But you're the Punisher, you kill people. I'm just trying to fill up my car. So,
Right.
That is part of the argument of the book, is that you have this character who presents a paradox. He is, on the one hand, and I call him an he, although technically it's an it. But once you read 1,000 comic books, you begin to feel like the character is real.
So we've been talking there quite a bit about iconography, I think, and obviously there's been different periods where the iconography has been used and taken and had different meanings and imbued with different meaning. So first of all, I think there's a burning question that everyone would like the answer to, especially those who aren't too familiar with the character. So how does the Punisher get his trademark skull t-shirt?
I'm pretty sure it was Jerry Conway who suggested it, and then it's John Romita Sr. who kind of perfects it, gets the skull the right shape. Because of course, with these logos, these chevrons, you do want to get it right, and you have a tiny amount of space, and this is going to be the way readers identify the character, right? More than hairstyle or even costume. And what I was struck by thinking about this character was how much more specific the message is to readers than with other kinds of comic book characters. That if you have a giant S, that might suggest a kind of strength, but it doesn't tell you about the emotional makeup of, Clark Kent, Superman. Blue Beetle, or lots of comic book characters have attractive, memorable chevrons and logos and iconography. But the Punishers, I think to a much greater extent than any major character in commercial comic books, has a set of visual symbols that are there to tell you that this is about anger and murder.
The other thing which is kind of interesting about this, as well as a chevron or a symbol, is that for many people, especially in the United States, and for our audience based here, they will know that many trucks, many vehicles driving around the US, whether it be New York or Arizona, you're going to see the skull emblem from the Punisher on the back of vehicles. We mentioned in the previous question about tattoos and emblems and symbols that have been taken, especially by armed forces, Blue Lives Matter movement, various different sort of political and quite extremist movements to some degree as well. But what I mean to say is that for many people, this symbol is actually affiliated more with politics, and they would think it's maybe a political organization. They wouldn't know about Frank Castle and about the comic. They would know now. The emblem's been so successful, has been so iconic, and it is so transferable in a sense that it's been used by all these different groups. And I think for many people, especially in the US, they won't know it as the Punisher. They'll know it as what those people have on the back of their cars, kind of thing. And it's become deeply politicized, I think. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything you had to say about that? It's obviously it's simple and very effective in the same way as, say, like the Wu-Tang Clan's W symbol, talking about another New York institution, so effective and taps into comic book culture with the Batman symbol, for example. But this one is imbued with a lot more politics and I guess the character's journey than many.
One of the things I was deeply interested in and was not able to nail down were things like the number of ancillary items that Marvel was selling with Punisher imagery in a given year. You know, how many different Punisher t-shirts were available in 1980 or 1990? Right. I never found a way to figure that out. The empirical data that's available has to do with comic book sales, because that's required by the post office.
Right.
And so I did trawl through those little boxes that they used to print in comics where they would give post office numbers. But what was clear was that this was a character for whom the primary at some point became ancillary and the ancillary became primary. That when I first followed the character, and for readers of my generation, print is primary, and if you buy something with the logo, that's secondary. And I think for a long time that was Marvel's sort of framework, was the print drives the ancillary sales, and the ancillary sales help bring people back to the stores.
Right.
That all breaks down in the 90s in the mid 90s, when Marvel's desperately looking for cash and beginning to realize that if you put almost anything with a Punisher symbol on it, you can make money. Now, what's interesting about the most recent explosion of Punisher iconography is that most of it is not licensed.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
And so, you know, a skull by itself, of course, cannot be licensed. The chevron can, or trademarked. The chevron has enough distinctive visual elements that you can enforce that, but you can get pretty close to a recognizable Punisher image and still be free of copyright or trademark protection. And that's created an enormous difficulty, I think, for Marvel, because if you think about it, you know, 2024 is the character's 50th anniversary. There aren't that many characters from the 70s. Wolverine is the other big one, maybe Ghost Rider, but there's a very limited number of characters who are going to have 50th anniversaries in the next few years. And not so long ago, if you went into almost any comic book store, you would be flooded with Punisher material. Mm-hmm. Once the Netflix series took off, most Punisher comics started to show up in stores in the form of reprints, which are still an important piece of Marvel's sort of backlist. But at this point, the iconography is self-sustaining. And even if Marvel killed off the character, I strongly suspect long after, YouTube is replaced by some other website, hundreds of years from now, there will still be people, or at least 100 years from now, there will still be people using the Punisher icon as shorthand for basically a line from a 80s song. Some people should die. That's just unconscious knowledge. Perry Farrell. Gains addiction. When I heard that line, I thought, oh, right, I have to put that in the Punisher book.
I wondered where that comes from.
That's his philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, I wondered where that had come from. So yeah, maybe just go a little deeper on that one. I recognize that statement from the book, but that comes from did you say a Jane's Addiction song?
Yeah, from their second album, Nothing Shocking.
Right, and then that you kind of put the two and two together. That became, you kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, this is Frank Castle in a nutshell, encapsulated.
Yeah. I mean, you asked about my research process. Part of it was just pulling comics out of books. Part of it was going through other boxes to see if there were related titles. Some of the Batman titles, of course, cover or overlap with the Punisher. So I was looking for kind of hardcore vigilantes in general.
Yeah.
And then went through my own sort of personal library and realized I had more books that touched on New York City and touched on the 70s and 80s and touched on the sort of politics of crime than I realized. So it's clearly been a kind of slow burning obsession for decades.
Were there any other characters among those that you kind of thought, oh, this character's been very much influenced by Frank Castle, or alternatively, oh, this character clearly is like maybe a part of the genesis of Frank Castle?
There are lots of minor characters. The one that comes to mind is Fool Killer, who's one of my favorites. In a way, he's even more political than Frank Castle. He definitely has an anti-hippie thing. I'm also fond of a short-lived character named the Beard Hunter, who couldn't grow facial hair and therefore kept on roofs with his diary, taking out men with beards.
These are fantastic costumed heroes if I've ever heard of them. These are new to me. These are great.
They're fairly obscure, but I think that the Punisher has more or less occupied almost all of the territory that belongs to the lone wolf killer in comics. The Punisher is so successful that when people in Hollywood sit around trying to figure out how to make a movie out of the Executioner, who's the 1969 pulp literature character who influences Frank Castle, that conversation is difficult because they can't figure out how to distinguish the Executioner from the Punisher. So imagine having the rights to a character who's older than the Punisher, who you can't use because the Punisher so perfectly fills that category.
Yeah.
It's a little like being RC Cola and watching Coke just fill supermarket. The Punisher is I call him a contagious character. There's a kind of contagious quality to his success in the 90s. Much of that kind of moment has passed. Comics has gone in other directions. But if you start looking, you see his influence everywhere, particularly in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s.
A couple of quick ones for you then. It sounds like you keep referring back to the 90s, the period, the 90s. It sounds like that was like a golden era, not only for the character, but especially the character through literature, through comic books, and like perhaps the most prolific period and the most interesting period. So are there any particular writers from that period that you really kind of enjoyed or you found particularly intriguing, just so that maybe other readers here could go back and check out some of that work themselves?
Let me just quickly say the 90s really is 2 decades for both Marvel and Frank Castle. The early 90s is the period of the greatest popularity. It's also, I think, not coincidentally, the period where the murder rate peaks in New York City and many other large cities in the United States. So the anxiety that's driving readers to embrace this horrific kind of campaign has a kind of persuasive quality in the early 90s as people just despair, will the crime rate ever come down? And then the second half of the 90s, and in New York City in particular, there's this dramatic drop in murder and violent crime in general. If you look at crime statistics, violent crime between, say, 95 and 2023, the one outlier is 2001. It's 9/11. That's like just an absurdly different day from the point of view of the study of murder in New York City than any other day in the last 50 years. Setting aside 9/11, of course, the trend in general until COVID has been very positive. In terms of writers, there are 2 writers who I want to mention. One is Mike Baron, who is still writing kind of crime and vengeance comics, self-publishing, I think. Maybe he's working with a small publisher. Mike Baron's a conservative. He's very witty, very strong opinions. And I think he's the writer who gave Frank Castle the most definition, the most believability. His kind of opposite number is Garth Ennis. Mike Baron's great run is from the late 80s through the early 90s. Garth Ennis is the last 20 years, particularly early 2000s. And Garth Ennis brings a wicked sense of humor to the character. Garth Ennis and Mike Baron are very different people. Mike Baron lived through the sort of 60s, 70s and has some of that cultural war anger. Garth Ennis grew up in Northern Ireland watching American television, and he finds America hilarious and uses his comics to share his sensibility with his American friends. And so his Punisher is more flamboyant. I doubt anybody will ever do anything with the character that hasn't already been done.
Right. Right.
It's complicated in that you have a character who in many ways is quite two-dimensional, and yet people have done these, really different and interesting things with the character. I tend to think now we're seeing a kind of return to things that people have already tried.
Right.
A more mystical Punisher, a more guilt-ridden Punisher, a Punisher who understands that New York has changed. There's these different kind of things you can add, these bells and whistles. But part of the joy of working on this is it's a little like a haiku, right? It's a little like studying the haiku. You are working with a form that is extremely important, right? You can't ignore the form.
Gotcha.
This is a character who has to kill people, and he has to be angry about it, and there have to be reasons for it, and you have to loathe the people he kills. But even with that very strong sense of predetermination, this is a character who just as for readers keeps surprising us. But I think for people consuming icons and streaming, there's fewer surprises.
Very well put. Well, I wanted to ask you too. What's next for you? What are you working on now? Are you sticking with the comic books, the anti-heroes, or are you moving on to pastures new, creatively speaking?
This is my 7th and last book on comics, I think. I've turned to film. It was partly The Punisher.
Right.
It was just, I hadn't quite realized how much I would enjoy seeing 70s pulp films on the big screen. I was really lucky when I was working on The Punisher. There was a local movie theater where the programmer and I were friends, and we both had this sort of love of 70s cinema.
Nice.
So now I'm interested in pre-70s cinema, the kind of Hollywood that gives us the 70s. So in a way, I'm working backwards rather than forwards. But it's just film, and I'm exploring genre. I'm still interested in genre, and I'm interested in when genre most powerfully intersects with politics.
Will you be not less of a genre, more of a style, I suppose, but will you be revisiting some of those classic film noir movies, especially the ones from the later period of the 50s? I'm thinking of Mickey Spillane, Mike Hammer type characters who, again, kind of flamboyant anti-heroes.
Mike Hammer shows up in the first chapter, and he is an uncle or a grandfather to the Punisher. Actually, the genre that interests me most right now is the musical and the studio era musical. And one thing I'm struck by is how our thinking about the musical warps our understanding of the musical. That far more musicals are depressing, somber, unhappy. A few of them are even noirish. There are about 15 or 20 noirish musicals. And that the fact that the literature hasn't picked up on the unhappy musical, to me, is interesting. Just like when I was thinking about superheroes and Marvel Comics, people were writing about lots of aspects, but they weren't writing about the Punisher. And so I'm grateful to this political science background, even though I think the people who taught me might be, baffled by how I got here.
I'm really loving this rich vein of intertextual research that you've been undertaking these past few years, and I look forward to seeing what you produce next. And I'm sure there will be some obvious connections with your preceding works, especially this book on the Punisher. I want to thank you very, very much for your time today. It's been fantastic and fascinating. Let's have. Am
I allowed to do this?
You certainly can, and I will just, for those who can't quite make that out, I will just say that A Cultural History of the Punisher, Marvel Comics and the Politics of Vengeance is now available. Best place to get hold of a copy would be www.intellectbooks.com, but from any good bookstore or online vendor retailer. You can go and find it out there. So do take a look at that, and then of course do take a look at Kent Worcester's other work as well, because again, a man with a very rich research heritage. And go and check out some of those songs, and I imagine we might be getting a playlist from Kent to add to the books page, but we already have a really fantastic contribution where Kent has provided us a little bit of analysis around 10 of his favorite covers from The Punisher, from the franchise over the years. So if you go to our Instagram page or one of our other social media accounts, you can see that. You'll also be able to see, of course, this interview and various other interviews and reviews with Kent, along with other work that we'll be sharing for the immediate future and thereafter. So I urge you all to take a look at that. And again, A Cultural History of the Punisher is available now from interletbooks.com. And Kent, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure. Any final thoughts or anything from you?
No, I'm just very grateful to Intellect. You've been great.
Well, we always love to hear that, and we look forward to maybe that future book coming through us as well. Well, thanks so much, Ken, and until next time.
Cheers.